Welcome back, everyone, to Law School Life and Beyond's Leadership Series. My name is Katya, and I am the host of this podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by Benjamin Ries. Ben is a staff lawyer at the Downtown Legal Services in Toronto, where he focuses primarily on housing law. So I'm really excited to have him come on and kind of describe to us what housing law is and what his practice entails, as well as his advice to future and current law students and his journey to and from law school. So with that, thank you so much, Ben, for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
So what drew you to a career in law?
It's hard to say that I was drawn to a career in law. I didn't really know much about the law before law school. I grew up in a small town, and I think I have very faint memories of my little sisters and I when we were really young playing lawyers, which really just involved stuffing scrap paper into an old briefcase and taking turns walking around with it. We didn't know anything else about the legal profession, and that stayed the same for me for most of my early years. I knew a couple things growing up. I understood, number one, my parents kind of impressed on me this idea: you have to go to university if you can. Mm-hmm. But don't worry, whatever it is, then, that'll lead to a better job, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's kind of an outdated Canadian middle-class idea. But the other thing I understood was, you have to pay your way through university. Mm-hmm. So I was, from a pretty young age working in construction and as a janitor and in kitchens and in nearly every one of those jobs that I had through public school and high school, I met people who said, get out if you can, kind of idea, right? This idea, make good choices, study hard, and try to get a better job than this. And that was sort of a common thread. And so I did study hard. I started out at systems design engineering at Waterloo. Nice. It was sort of the most direct way I saw to, linking up success in school with some kind of job that was supposed to be better. But I left after first year. I transferred into political science because I just missed some of the arts and humanities and that side of things. But, I think kind of that was the first time I really had an idea of what I liked and didn't like for myself. And it was later on in studying political science that I think I started to see the law as sort of one application of some of the things I was studying. I was studying power and relationships between people in society. And, I got to understand that, okay, well, the law is one sort of structured way in which a lot of those ideas are sort of carried out. And I think the structure and the sort of problem-solving aspect appealed to some of the same reasons I went into engineering. But I still didn't know anything about law school. And in my final year of undergrad, I was married. And my wife at the time kind of understood that I like to argue and, and she saw a couple pamphlets from law schools at the Student Life Center and just grabbed a couple for me. And when on deadline evening of law school applications, I just looked at my desk and saw those two pamphlets and said, oh, what the heck? And then, fired off a couple applications, then realized, I have to write this thing called the LSATs, then, studied for everything was backwards. And I sort of tripped, fell and stumbled into it was worked out for me, fortunately. I think it was really reckless, but yeah, that's how I ended up in first year law school at U of T. Nice. Without really knowing the half of what I had gotten myself into. And it maybe, we'll discuss later, I think, how it ended up working out for me, but I think it was a lot of luck. Yeah.
What did you think of law school once you got in then? Were you like, oh no, this was a huge mistake, or no, I'm actually in the right place?
I think I felt both at the same time, if that's possible. I'll say what was good and what was bad about law school, but maybe in the reverse order. So what was bad, I think, and now I still think about that because I work at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and I'm constantly confronted with what is good for law students, what do they need, and what'll make this less painful. And I remember in first year engineering, pretty much every course that I had matched a course offered in the public school curriculum. Like it's just a little bit harder, right? Like you calculus, you physics. So like, there was a way in which you could progress out of a public school, high school education. And then on top of that, all of my professors that I remember in engineering were very explicit that, okay, it's all of these topics, and we're going to tell you what it means to be an engineer. There's a lot of very explicit discussion about what this profession is, what it does, what its history is, and how all these subjects link together. And I think it helped that a lot of my engineering professors identified first and foremost themselves as engineers. So they say, you're joining our profession. And it was explicit. I think something like that happens in the medical professions as well. But you show up in law school and, it took me a long while, I think several years, to understand, okay, but why tort, property, contract, criminal, constitutional? Why? What are these subjects? Why these subjects? And never mind, and what do they all have to do with like a professional identity? It doesn't help that I think a lot of my professors explicitly did not identify as lawyers. They were sort of, hanging off on the sidelines and observing everything. And that's really weird, right? Because you're saying, okay, I'm hurtling towards this thing, but nobody can quite tell me what it is or what we're using to get there. So I think that, plus just meeting an incredible number of classmates who came from extremely wealthy backgrounds, and that seemed to be the way in which they understood what was coming next, was really alienating. But I think what was fantastic about law school, and it's a big part of where I've ended up, was the clinic that I got involved in. So Downtown Legal Services is a student legal clinic. There's one in every Ontario law school that's been around sort of the longest. So it's a direct community public service clinic. And I got to volunteer there in first year. And when they presented their menu of what they did, criminal and refugee law and housing law, right away, it made more sense. Like those topic areas, I thought, well, I've actually had some experience, as a worker with workers' rights and not getting paid what I was offered. I've had lots of experience as a tenant with landlords screwing me around. And so these
real life things.
These things fit together. And I was able to at least use some of my previous life experience with housing right away, like immediately, and it was through being at the clinic that I could look back at everything else that was going on in law school and start to see, I see how this is useful. I see how contract principles matter here. And that, that became kind of a centering place. And in a way, I never really left. I mean, I'm right back in the same clinic where I started as a student volunteer. I'm so fortunate to be where I am, but I think it was easily the best part of law school.
That's amazing. That is so amazing that you're right back where you started. And so then, while we're on the topic, can you please describe, so your main focus right now is housing law. Can you please describe what that is? And then I guess now my second half of my question was why you decided to pursue it, but because you kind of stumbled on it in law school. But what is housing law?
Yeah. So I would say housing law is, like I say, focused on the different parts of formal law and procedure that are most come into play around people's need, that sort of very human need for a home. And I personally don't really think that ownership law, like real estate, and I guess trespass and property, is very central to that, because I think that there are many ways in which the law treats an owned home not different than an owned bicycle, or it's just property. And I think the wealthier you get, the more a home is just arbitrary property. But for people who I guess may otherwise struggle to meet that kind of central human need. The law, fortunately, I think in some ways, maybe not enough, bends and changes and is shaped more by those needs rather than, I don't know, what Aristotle said, right? So, central to housing law, at least in Ontario and most of North America, is the rights and responsibilities of tenants, of renters. But at the edges of that, there's also the law of housing cooperatives, and I think that it filters out into other sort of fringe areas. I think land use planning and municipal bylaws about property standards, human rights, there are a number of other related areas, and I think at some point real estate kind of fits into that kind of periphery of housing law. But when we talk about meeting the need for everyone, then I think it's first and foremost what I've described.
Okay, so then what is the most common type of case that floats across your desk? Is it more like landlord-tenant issues, or that's actually the only thing I really know. So
landlord-tenant, right? And I think there was a time, some of my colleagues would just say what we're doing is landlord and tenant law or tenant rights. I think that's fair. That's the center of, because people below a certain income and an asset threshold tend to rent. That tends to be historically and sort of the current way in which people meet those housing needs or try to. And so, in that field, eviction is the most common type of case. It's a little different in a student clinic like ours. We will serve low-income households and communities around Toronto, but also fee-paying University of Toronto students, undergrads, graduate students, and there's a bit of difference and a bit of overlap in their needs. Often, students don't have as hard a time, for example, paying the rent. They're renting maybe within a shorter window, at least to start. But then that gives them I guess you could say, the time and the capacity to now look at other tenant rights like harassment, maintenance, and repair is a huge issue. And issues related to rent regulation. So landlords collecting, big deposits way past what's legal and then not returning them. Landlords trying for illegal rent increases, all of those issues. And then, I think most recently in Toronto of the past, over my career anyway, a huge rise in so-called no-fault evictions. So landlords saying, I need you to move out because I'm moving in, or my kid is moving in, or I'm planning on doing a renovation. And so our big focus there is this a scam?
Yeah.
And usually the answer is yes, it is. So dealing with those sort of no-fault evictions is a way of like displacing people and jacking up the rent. I think has become more and more a part of our practice.
Okay, so then what do you have to say about, I feel like the general consensus when people talk about landlord-tenant issues is that landlords have no rights and tenants can squat without paying rent for so long. What do you have to say about that, having working firsthand in the field?
Well, I think no rights is hyperbole. I mean, 90% of or so of the applications that the Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board receives are landlord applications overwhelmingly for eviction. So we spend most of our time talking about the landlord's rights. And, I think to be clear, the rights that we're comparing and contrasting here are, on the one hand, the tenant's right to an adequate standard of living, which is in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, so we're talking about something at least a half century old, a social right that people in most fields outside of the law understand as kind of taking very prime importance. I mean, people in
basic human
healthcare
right
understand that it's sort of key that you need shelter, that kind of thing. So that's one right, and trying to satisfy that right as an international human right or as a social goal on one hand, and on the other hand we have property rights. So
Yeah.
the idea that in particular the idea that the landlord has a right to make a certain amount of money off of the extra housing they own beyond their own housing.
Yeah.
So the I mean, there's going to be, depending on how you prioritize those rights, you're going to feel differently. I mean, but I would say long ago we understood, people seem to have accepted that there's not an unlimited right to make money off of your property because property is kind of just a constructed idea.
Yeah.
So, I think it's quite normal, and this is just beyond housing law. It's quite normal to have someone say, "Well, I'm not getting as much money as I'd like." I mean, that's almost a universal idea as well,
Yeah.
right? But I don't really know how to conceive of it as rights per se. I mean, the fact that we take someone and we evict them into homelessness, knowing full well that's the likely outcome, because someone else's name is on title and they say so, it already suggests to me that that we prioritize property rights by and large, and the limitations on a landlord's ability to, for example, make income from their property are, I don't know, are they more onerous than your limitations on your ability to open a manufacturing plant on your front lawn? Because zoning, I think, already pretty clearly constrains what you can do with your property. So yeah, I think these are political sentiments. They're not really.
No. And it's interesting coming from your perspective, like the cause of the landlord generally is kind of dwarfed by the rights of tenants. Like we're talking about shelter here and then we're talking about profit. So that's an interesting take coming from you, because I know that most people, when they want to go into owning a home and renting it out, everyone's like, oh, don't do that. Landlords have no rights. You'll never be able to get rid of the tenants, blah, 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 blah. And so it's interesting coming from your perspective, who's working on the ground, that, well, this is a huge, like a larger issue here. And this sentiment is kind of disappointing.
Yeah, the rights, I don't personally believe that you can actually compare these rights. I mean, it's apples and oranges. And I think that maybe if we focus on outcomes, right, I think we see that people who own one home, let alone more than one home, have done incredibly well historically, and also just in the past few years. I mean, in this election campaign right now, some parties have pointed out that the average cost of a home in Canada has risen by something like $300,000 and in the past 6 years. And I think there's some places in Toronto that have seen value increases of $300,000 in the past 2 years, right?
Yeah.
So if you already own one of those properties, let alone more, we have a climate that is going to make you money even if you have zero tenants who pay zero rent. So the rent that you get beyond that, people can decide whether it's for them, whether it's a business they want to get into. I think there are all kinds of questions, how you want to spend your time, what kind of conflicts you want to be in. But for those who have the stomach for it, I think landlords are doing just fine. It just, like, if we forget rights for a second, just look at outcomes, I think that's difficult to debate.
No, you're right. You're right. So then my next question is, what do you think is the largest challenge that your clients face generally?
I mean, if I'm looking for one in particular, it's capitalism, right?
Okay.
I mean, I mean, it's easy for me to put it in those terms, I guess, but I understand. I was raised certainly with fairly conservative values. I was raised in a small town. I didn't know very many renters. And it with this sort of public school idea that, like, well, supply and demand is what gives you an incentive to work hard for, the thing that you want. And that's a good thing. And if a thing becomes more valuable, more people work harder and it'll build wealth and grow the economy. Like, these ideas to me are like, I remember them from grade 7, right? And they have an intuitive attraction. And I would say that, you have your kind of, idealism when you're a student, and In undergrad, I certainly, as many students do, like explored other ideas about the world beyond what I'd seen in my hometown. But it wasn't until working as a lawyer for low-income communities and for people constantly at risk of losing their home or stuck with a home that was infested with bugs, or didn't have basic services working, paying never mind 30%, but 50, 60, 80% of their income on housing, and not having enough left over really to buy food, or to buy new clothes for their kids once in a while. When I look at that outcome, I think, okay, like this story about supply and demand and everybody just working a little bit harder to manage to pay more rent for the same or crappier place, because that's the option that is continually presented to people. Right or wrong, it's not working. I mean, I think that there's a large number of people who will not or cannot bring in any more income to meet the sort of average rent increase that they'll see over their lifetime. And instead, it's a game of hold on to your current tenancy as hard as you can, because if you're evicted, you're going to be presented with a whole different rental landscape than the protected rent that you've got. It's a game of, accepting lower and lower standards in terms of the quality of your housing, and certainly never hoping for it to ever improve. And I think finally, and I think this is something students understand as well as anyone, it's a game of doubling up. I mean, their students and other tenants are finding ways to pack more and more people into smaller and smaller spaces for the same rent, same rent per person. And so, the fact that we now have a situation where, a one bedroom plus den condo will be rented to 3 students is, I question at some point, if you're I've had clients who attempted to rent out a closet, and a landlord attempted to charge them for that closet in downtown Toronto more than what I paid for a bedroom in my undergrad, because that's just what the market has done. And, has anybody had the opportunity to really increase their income to match that? No. Is a closet a home? I mean, no. A lot of people would say, well, if that's a home, then, we've now really filled in the continuum all the way to a cardboard box, like all the way to homelessness. And so, I see all of that as connected to this idea that, like, well, the price is just whatever the market sets. And if we start with that kind of orthodoxy, all of these consequences fall on my clients' heads. Like, I think that's what's been happening, and it doesn't seem like it's going to get any better without a kind of fundamental shift in what we think ought to apply, maybe if not broadly, like at least to certain goods like housing. Do we really think that private markets can deliver on that kind of public school orthodoxy? If we change our minds on that, I think everything else has a chance of getting better.
That is a fascinating perspective, and I really appreciate you coming on here talking about this, because having someone on the ground working in this field, this is really invaluable. So thank you. So then my next question is a little bit of a shift more back to you personally. How do you personally define success?
Yeah, that's the other hard question. In addition to your first one, I'm not sure, right? And I think there's bad news about that. And this is for any student who's thinking about social justice lawyering, and that is that it's something that colleagues of mine have observed for a long time. There are no quick, easy wins in, you take on difficult work like this, and it's difficult in this way. This is the way in which it's the most difficult. And that is the change you want to see is too big for any one lawyer, let alone 50, to accomplish. It's maybe we question whether it's something that can be accomplished within the legal system. There's a lot of cynicism about that. And it's pretty popular in my field to say, it's community organizing, it's political mobilization that will, bring the kind of results that we really feel our clients deserve. So what are we doing? Well, we're doing some combination of, patches and leaks in the side of the ship kind of thing, where we're sort of muddling along, trying to keep as many individual people housed, grinding out for slight improvements, a little bit of compensation here. And it's difficult to see anything that's achievable as also, manifestly success in the larger sense. So I don't know that for myself personally, I feel privileged to do the work that I'm doing and to be able to afford like a decent standard of living doing it. I know that that's not available to very many people. And I think that's all the personal success that I expect. For me, what I would really define as success in my field is something on the order of a revolutionary shift in how we view housing. And I can't deliver that. That's something that more and more over the years I see as the reason why clinic lawyers, the legal aid clinic movement in Ontario have really committed and recommitted themselves to supporting community organizing, which is a difficult relationship. And it's difficult to understand how what might look like a bunch of people sending around newsletters and making posters or hashtags or whatever, that how that could be a bigger deal or more important or more capable of delivering change than, the big fancy litigation that lawyers do. But I don't really see even test case litigation that goes all the way to the Supreme Court as significantly moving the needle the way you have the potential of a large number of community members supporting each other and going to the polls, demanding change. I think that's something that has always had the better possibility. And the current kind of good things about housing law that we have didn't come from the considered opinion of a majority of the Supreme Court. They came from political mobilization, from like enough of a force of people in society saying, okay, you shouldn't just be able to evict somebody for any reason, right? There should be some way for some people to hold on to their housing even as economic conditions change around them. So that that's a political idea, and I think that's where I would locate my idea of success.
Okay. And then my last question, do you have any advice for future or current law students?
Yeah, lots of it. And in some ways, my job is to just give that advice all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like I teach in a clinical course at Downtown Legal Services, and along the way, I get to talk to students and give them at least advice about how to do the casework, and then maybe some of it broadens. But the best advice I've heard that I would pass on is something from a guy named Mike Rowe, who's the star of this show called Dirty Jobs. And
I love him. He's so good. He's so funny.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of maybe non-politically correct thing of citing him is that he seems also to be popular on like Fox News, and he's popular with Americans conservatives. So all that aside, and not a broad-based endorsement, I have heard him at least say one thing I think that is most poignant for law students, okay? Which is, Mr. Rowe has said that a growing problem in our society is that we tell young people, we tell kids that if they could just pick the right career and pursue it and then achieve success within that career as defined by that career, the implication is that's what's going to make you a person and like a good person or a happy person, that you put the career first. And I see that, I care quite a bit about the idea of professional identity, but I think that what we should say is that professional identity needs to be secondary to your actual identity. And I worry that students of mine, classmates, current students, all the same, are required through competition and stress about money and the future. They're required to sort of focus on, okay, well, can I just find the right summer job, the right articling job, the right career path, and then somehow at the end of that, all have turned out to be a happy person. I think that you have to see the two of them as completely separate. So to me, I would say that law students need to watch out for the law school life that's ready to fill up every last second of your time and every last, like, everything. You could do sports as a law student. You can have little clubs time as a law student. All your friends can be in law school. And I think intramurals and clubs and friends those are all great positive things. But I think just more students need to spend more time asking, but who am I though? And what do I care about? Because letting the profession as it is and the jobs that are on offer be the menu of the possible people that you can grow up to be, I think is a bad idea.
Okay.
I think that students need to insist on, meeting the legal market halfway, maybe. And that's, for some people, that means exiting the law before they're even started. For others, you end up falling into something that really works. For me, I have, but I didn't, get into a job that I'm quite satisfied with by picking it back in high school or in undergrad. Or even in first year. I fell into it, and some of it's funny and some of it's an accident, but a lot of it is through, being pretty certain about who I am.
Yeah.
And how I want to be, I guess. So like, do you want to be somebody who's able to have, human conversations with your clients about everything from, what the kids are doing to, their parents, their friends, like that's something you get to do in certain types of legal practice. You definitely don't seem to get to do in others. And figuring those things out first, I think, has to come first.
Okay. That's excellent advice. Honestly, thank you so much, Ben, for coming on the show. This was really nice chatting with you.
Great. Thank you.
And that concludes today's episode. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in as always. And be sure to tune in next week for Law School Life and Beyond's next episode of the Leadership Series.